Ruben Gutierrez is an inmate on Texas's death row. His case has reached the highest court in the United States. The U.S. Supreme Court is currently reviewing his appeal. The core of the review concerns his ability to challenge the state's refusal. He seeks permission to conduct DNA testing on crucial crime scene evidence. His execution was halted by the Supreme Court just minutes before it was scheduled to occur. Please like and subscribe if you're new to the channel. Gutierrez was convicted in 1999. The conviction stemmed from a brutal crime. The crime involved the murder and robbery of an 85-year-old woman. The victim was Scholastica Harrison. She was the elderly manager of a local trailer park. Harrison was known to keep a substantial amount of cash in her home. This was reportedly due to a deep distrust of banks. The amount was estimated to be over $600,000. Harrison was found stabbed multiple times. The weapon used included screwdrivers to the head. Gutierrez was subsequently convicted for this crime. He received a death sentence. Gutierrez admits his involvement in the events leading to the crime. He acknowledges planning the robbery. However, he steadfastly maintains his innocence regarding the killing itself. He claims that his two co-defendants were responsible for Harrison's death. These individuals were Rene Garcia and Pedro Gracia. Rene Garcia was sentenced to life imprisonment for his role. Pedro Gracia remains at large. Gutierrez has pursued DNA testing for more than a decade. He seeks analysis of specific evidence collected from the crime scene. This includes bloodstains, fingernail scrapings, and hair samples. He believes that testing this evidence could potentially prove his innocence of the murder. Alternatively, it could demonstrate that he was not the direct perpetrator. Such findings could significantly impact his legal status. Specifically, testing could affect his eligibility for the death sentence. His legal team asserts that no physical or forensic evidence directly links him to the act of killing. They argue the state's case relied heavily on other forms of evidence. Texas has established a statute governing post-conviction DNA testing. This law is often described as particularly strict. It imposes significant limitations on when testing is permitted. Under this statute, testing is generally allowed only if the results would conclusively prove innocence. This means the results must show the person would not have been convicted at all. The law sets a high bar for access to testing. Crucially, the statute does not permit testing solely because the results might affect a person's death sentence. If the evidence only mitigates culpability but doesn't negate guilt entirely, testing is often denied. This specific limitation has been a major hurdle in Gutierrez's case. His requests for testing have been repeatedly denied under state law based on this restriction. Gutierrez's attorney has characterized this requirement as a catch-22. They argue it creates an impossible situation for inmates seeking potentially exculpatory evidence. The strict criteria make accessing testing exceedingly difficult. Facing denial under state law, Gutierrez pursued a different legal avenue. He filed a federal lawsuit. This action was brought under Section 1983 of the U.S. Code. Section 1983 allows individuals to sue state officials for alleged deprivation of constitutional rights. Gutierrez argued that the Texas DNA statute violated his right to due process under the Constitution. He contended the statute's limitations unfairly denied him access to potentially crucial evidence. A federal district court initially ruled in Gutierrez's favor. The court agreed that the statute's restrictions were problematic. It found that limiting testing based on whether it proved total innocence versus merely affecting sentencing made the right to challenge death penalty eligibility illusory. The court described it as a meaningless ritual. However, the state appealed this decision. The case proceeded to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Fifth Circuit reversed the district court's ruling. The appellate court ruled against Gutierrez. Its decision was based on a specific legal concept. The court determined that Gutierrez lacked standing to bring the lawsuit. The Fifth Circuit's ruling hinged entirely on the legal doctrine of standing. Standing is a fundamental requirement for bringing a case in federal court. It ensures that the plaintiff has a sufficient connection to and harm from the law or action challenged. To establish standing, a plaintiff must typically demonstrate three things. They must show they suffered an injury in fact. This injury must be traceable to the defendant's conduct. Finally, it must be likely that a favorable court ruling will provide a remedy for the injury. The Fifth Circuit agreed that Gutierrez had suffered an injury. The denial of DNA testing constituted a concrete harm. This part of the standing test was met. However, the Fifth Circuit concluded that Gutierrez failed the third prong. The court ruled he lacked standing because a favorable ruling from the federal court would not necessarily compel the prosecutor to allow the testing. They reasoned that even with a court order, the prosecutor might still find other grounds under state law to deny access. The Supreme Court's review of Gutierrez's case centers precisely on this point. The court will examine whether the Fifth Circuit correctly assessed the likelihood of a remedy. The central question is how certain the outcome must be for standing to exist. Specifically, the court will decide if standing requires a particularized determination. This means assessing what a specific state official, like the local prosecutor, would likely do after a favorable federal judgment. The Fifth Circuit conducted this specific inquiry. Gutierrez's legal arguments bear a strong resemblance to those made in a recent significant case. That case involved Rodney Reed, another Texas death row inmate. Reed also brought a Section 1983 lawsuit challenging the application of the Texas DNA statute. Reed's challenge in Reed v. Gertz 2023 focused on issues related to the chain of custody of evidence. Like Gutierrez, he sought federal intervention to access DNA testing. The Supreme Court ultimately sided with Rodney Reed in that case. In Reed v. Gertz, the Supreme Court found that Reed did have standing. The court assumed that a favorable ruling, finding the state's actions unconstitutional, would likely induce the prosecutor to grant access to the testing. The court did not require Reed to prove with certainty what the prosecutor would do. The Fifth Circuit's decision in Gutierrez's case appears to have departed from the Supreme Court's approach in Reed. The Fifth Circuit applied a stricter standard for the likelihood of remedy requirement. It conducted a fact-specific inquiry into the potential actions of the specific prosecutor involved in Gutierrez's case. This contrasts with the more general assumption made by the Supreme Court in Reed. Judge James Dennis Higginson dissented from the Fifth Circuit's ruling. He argued there was no meaningful distinction between Gutierrez's case and Rodney Reed's. He believed that the Fifth Circuit should have followed the Supreme Court's precedent from Reed v. Gertz. The Supreme Court recognized the importance of the issue and the potential conflict with its own precedent. The court granted certiorari to hear Gutierrez's case. This means they agreed to review the Fifth Circuit's decision. The specific question the court is considering is narrow but critical. It asks whether the standing requirement, as articulated in Reed v. Gertz, demands a specific determination of what a particular state official would do after a favorable federal ruling. The outcome will clarify the scope of federal court access for inmates challenging state procedures. Oral arguments in the case were heard by the Supreme Court. During the arguments, the justices appeared divided on the issue. Their questions and comments revealed differing perspectives on standing and the implications of the Texas statute. Justice Elena Kagan drew a direct parallel between the two cases. She likened Gutierrez's complaint to the one brought by Rodney Reed. Her questions suggested skepticism about the Fifth Circuit's distinction. Justice Brett Kavanaugh also seemed sympathetic to Gutierrez's position. He questioned the state's argument that a prosecutor's potential non-compliance could negate a plaintiff's standing. He appeared concerned about creating a loophole that would prevent federal review. Justice Samuel Alito raised questions about the defense's arguments. He probed the distinction between evidence affecting guilt versus evidence affecting only death eligibility. He questioned whether this distinction should influence the likelihood of a prosecutor granting testing. A ruling from the Supreme Court is expected in the coming months. The decision will have significant implications for this case and potentially others. This case highlights the significant procedural hurdles faced by death row inmates. Seeking to present new evidence, particularly DNA evidence, often involves navigating complex state and federal laws. Proving actual innocence after conviction is exceedingly difficult. Texas law has evolved regarding DNA testing. The state now requires DNA testing for biological material collected in death penalty cases going forward. However, officials often refuse to apply these newer standards to older cases. Gutierrez's attorneys argue that if his crime occurred today, DNA testing would likely have been conducted as a matter of course. They contend that such testing could have potentially prevented a death sentence. The current legal battle is over accessing testing for a crime that occurred before the law changed. Under existing Supreme Court precedent, a claim of actual innocence alone is generally not sufficient to save a person from execution. Federal courts typically require a showing of a separate constitutional violation in the process leading to conviction or sentencing. Gutierrez's lawsuit attempts to frame the denial of testing as such a violation. The Supreme Court's ruling in this case could have a significant impact. It will directly affect Ruben Gutierrez's ability to pursue DNA testing. Furthermore, it could establish precedent that impacts other death row inmates in Texas and potentially other states who are seeking post-conviction DNA analysis. Ruben Gutierrez does not currently have an execution date scheduled. His execution remains stayed. This stay is in place specifically while the Supreme Court considers his case. This is not the first time Gutierrez has received a stay of execution from the Supreme Court. A previous stay was granted in 2020. That earlier stay concerned a separate legal issue regarding his request for access to a spiritual advisor or chaplain in the execution chamber.